Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Awesome. Hello, welcome to my talk. I'm Leigh Harris, as the slide suggests, Senior Game Designer at Wargaming Sydney, formerly the co-director and founder of Flat Earth Games with my sister Alyssa, and the two of us embarked on making games together. And we made a spectacularly large one, which blew out by every dimension you can think of, and this talk is about that game, the game's Objects in Space. So a little about me, just for context. I spent 9 years working at Rockstar Games in PR, and 8 years running Flat Earth Games with Alyssa. And during that 8 years, I spent 2 or 3 years part-time working as a games journalist. I wrote for all kinds of publications. Most notably, I was the founding editor on MCV Pacific, which you might know if you've been keeping up to date with industry news. And 2 or 3 years part-time as a game design teacher at AIE, which is the Academy of Interactive Entertainment. What's that for?
Okay.
Oh, I get a clicker.
There you go.
Awesome. Which button do I press? That one. Nice. All right. And for the past year, I've been working as a senior game designer at Wargaming Sydney. Cool. Okay, so just to give you a bit of an idea of what this talk is going to be, it's a little bit unusual, but hopefully it's of value. What I want to try and do is help everyone in the audience understand how our game went from being a 2-year production to a 5-year production. I want to visualize a lot of the decisions that got made that led to that happening so that it's an easy thing for you to absorb the real magnitude of what seemed like a whole bunch of rational choices along the way. Basically, I learned the hard way what it costs to not be able to properly scope your project from the beginning, and I'd like to try and spare you that pain. So it's sort of a diary of what happened to get us from our initial concept and what we wanted to build through to the end of it. So I'll first start by going over the game in very broad strokes, give you an idea of what it is so you have enough context to be able to follow along with the design decisions that I'm making. I'll start at the very beginning, explain the first couple of things we knew we wanted to try and make, and then go step by step through all of those reasonable design choices, reasonable, to get us there. So by the end of it, you should see a massive tangled web of a flowchart, which will give you an idea of exactly what went into it all, and it should help to really solidify in your minds what the outcomes of all this were. In order to get there, 5 years in development is a long time for a studio that had a reasonable success with our first game, but it wasn't 5 years in development successful, so we had to take on a lot of money from publishers, investors, and government grants and things like that to get us there. So the point being that most of the money that the game has made thus far has been recouped by other people, and rightly so. So that was the real tangible cost of what you're about to see. So picture this. It's late 2013. We've just released our first game. Towncraft was reasonably successful, but most of the contracting we had to do was out to sound effects people, musicians, artists, because between myself and Alyssa, we just didn't have those skills. She was a programmer and designer, and I was a straight designer, and we thought, okay, what's an idea that's going to help us make games without needing to rely too much on other people? What's something that really limits the art that's required? So what we thought was we would make this. So this is the bridge. I suppose I don't need the microphones too much. This is the bridge of the series Starship. It's the main bridge in the game, and you spend a lot of time here. All of those monitors are different screens on the bridge, which you click on in order to zoom in and use. So the ship is kind of like a submarine. You fly around in space. It's a big open world. You buy and sell goods, take jobs where you can get them, all the while trying to avoid pirates. You've got your sensor system in the top left, navigation screen down the bottom middle, and the fact that you can't look out the front window and see anything that's out there in space, we thought would save us a lot of money on art. And to an extent, we were right. It's just that was not as big of a cost in the grand scheme of what we tried to make as we thought. So that's the bridge. It's a fixed perspective. You use the arrow keys left and right to switch between the rooms of your ship. This is a close-up of the navigation map, and this is the closest thing to an actual representation of where you sit in the game world that you'll ever see. This is the engineering section, which somewhat resembles a flowchart. And you've got all the different components that make up the modules on your ship, so it tells them whether or not they're functioning and at what capacity. But you can get off your ship via the airlocks, and again, when you're on a space station, you just move left or right with the arrow keys, and it just toggles between one room and the next. So this is where you embark and disembark, and this is you speaking to an NPC who is unhappy with you. Okay. So, we wanted to make a submarine simulator. This idea came from Alyssa. She'd played a whole lot of them when she was younger. We grew up playing games in the 80s and 90s and that sort of thing. So think 688 Hunter Killer and you're in roughly the right ballpark, or Silent Service or something like that. We wanted to make an open world game. We both adored open world games and always had. We played a lot of Grand Theft Auto and some open world RPGs and things like that, and we thought, what a great opportunity. If you can't see outside, we can just make an open world as big as we want and it'll be super easy, barely an inconvenience. And a nice 2D pixel art style. We thought this would keep it retro and make it simple. We can just do a few basic screens to represent the different rooms of the ship and space stations, and boom. That was the original, modest idea. A submarine simulator. What do they have in them? Sensor systems, so you can detect what else is out there. Power systems that you have to manage so that you can figure out how much or how detectable you are to other ships. And that all amounts to stealth action combat. So essentially we were making a stealth action game in space. Because it's an open world, we thought, okay, we're going to need quests for people to embark on. And once we realized how many quests usually go into open world games, for some reason we were undeterred. We ended up landing on about 120. About 60 different space stations that you could visit, and I stress different because we wanted them all to look visually different to one another so that you weren't bored by seeing the same thing all the time, and visually different in groups as well as you went from one nation to the other. There are 8 nations in the lore of this game world, across 30 different star systems, all of which were built by hand, including all the nebulas, asteroid belts, and space stations, everything to do with drop rates, pirate spawn points, all of it. So it's starting to already get a little bit bigger. But this is that phase of the project where you're really excited, anything's possible. I think at the moment it's 2014. And one of the requirements, at least in our mind, one of the requirements of an open world game is that it has multiple progression systems. Usually you're building up your character, for want of a better term, in a number of different ways. Sometimes you'll be doing it through attack and defense and stats in an RPG. Other times it'll be the accumulation of goods and things like that. So, based off 120 quests, we realized we would need about 300 characters. That's 300 characters, all with branching dialogue, and that's not including the number of NPCs that would be required to be procedurally generated so as to populate the space stations and make them look appropriate. You want a bunch of working class people to be over on that mining station there, and a bunch of militaristic types in the fascist state and that sort of thing. And I feel like pinpointing this moment as one of the moments where things got a bit out of hand. So, if you're familiar with hub and spoke dialogue design, that's where you've got one central point and you pick one of, say, 4 different things, options for things you want to talk about, and the NPC will describe those things to you, and then you return to the hub, and that option is now grayed out. So you have to write bits of dialogue times 3, and then there's an exit option, for example, and they all need to work in any order, which is a little bit tricky. Choose Your Own Adventure dialogue, which is how I'm referring to it here, has the dialogue always moving forward. You never return to that hub. So every time you make an option for something to say, you are inherently ruling out the other options. This multiplies the amount of work that you have to do on any given conversation by, I'm going to say, 10. This is probably one of the dumbest decisions we made in the entire game. It's awesome. Because of the choose your own dialogue, we kind of got into a kick about this. We were like, yeah, naturalistic dialogue. We didn't want NPCs to be vending machines where you put in a button or you put in a click and they give you a bunch of information about the game world. That's just so video game. It's so passé. We want something real. So we kind of got a bit more into that and ended up adding what I guess I'll say is a core pillar to the game, which was naturalistic presentation. We wanted things to not feel too much like you were playing a video game. Again, this is the bit where it gets a bit out of hand. Oh, sorry, I just took an extra slide to focus on the fact that I was color coding it. So the combat systems are all linked in blue. The orange ones are the content of the game, and I've put yellow as systems of the game. Now, because we wanted a naturalistic presentation, we didn't want a HUD. Nothing to tell you how much health you were on that was sitting between you and the game world. You were interacting directly with monitors that really existed in that universe. We wanted you to only interface with diegetic NPCs, monitors, screens, and things like that. We wanted time to be a factor. We wanted time to always move forward. So when you start our game, you have 3 months of in-game time, sped up of course, not real time, 3 months of in-game time where events are constantly taking place. So unlike, say, a Skyrim, where whenever you get out to where an NPC is, they're already there waiting for you. They've been waiting for you their entire lives just so they can give you this quest. We wanted something that would be a little bit more naturalistic than that by having it that, based on the events that are going on in the wider game world, which you can read about in the news articles we wrote a lot of, that the NPC is reacting to the events in the game world. This is happening right now. It's good that you're here at this moment in time. And I've moved Choose Your Own Adventure dialogue to a sub-part of naturalistic presentation because at this point we had a bunch of things that were all stemming from this new ideal that we had. So, 300 characters in a 2D pixel art style. Well, that's easy. We can just do simple character portraits. Simple character portraits just of someone leaning at a bar and then they're smiling and then they're frowning and we're done. Pixel art, easy. We can do this. We've got volume. However, we had a big problem. This is one of the other areas where it blew out, which I am proud to say was not a design decision. We had highly detailed and informative monitors in this game. You saw the screenshot earlier. You have so much information on those ships to try and tell you what's going on. With every system, every weapon, everything that's going on needs to be conveyed to you. However, if we go for 2D pixel art, that means that the ability to show you what's on one of those screens but zoomed out so you can still see it legibly can only exist if that texture that's providing the information is in a 3D space. So we realized we would have to go 3D. We decided not to change the design. We just thought, it's fine, we'll just make it work in 3D. We were using an engine called Cocos 2DX. So we made the jump to 3D, which meant our 2D pixel art style was no longer one of our core elements. Instead, with a 3D pixel art style. So on top of making it 3D, we still tried to retain that retro feel. So some people still think our game is 2D until you see the characters animate, but we went for sort of a late 90s Half-Life-esque sort of lo-fi, low-poly style. So 3D pixel art style replaces 2D pixel art style. So no longer can we have simple character portraits. Now we need a modular 3D character design system for a 2D engine. We also need modular 3D assets that we can turn into space stations, and they have to have so much variety it's not funny. When you get out to one star system, you should know just from looking at where you are, I'm in Galileo right now. I'm in Parsis. Ooh, I don't want to be here. This is clearly a pirate space station. Uniqueness was a big part of what we were trying to provide. I'm going to go back for a second. There's one thing I haven't touched on yet, which was an interesting choice, and it comes back to one of the fundamentals. This is a stealth action combat game in an open world. Can anyone tell me why that was dumb? Show of hands. Who wants to give me something that might come up that could be a problem?
AI?
Yeah, a lot of it's required, but what about the AI?
Because you can move in any direction, or because it's so big, how do you determine when they can see you?
Yeah, so how do you determine when an AI can see you in a massive open world? Actually, that's very, very close. Yeah. So from a design perspective, my problem with it is, let's take Assassin's Creed, for example. You enter into an area you're not supposed to be into, and the screen turns red, warning, you're now entering into a zone where you are wanted. If you're seen here, you're in trouble. And the player knows, okay, I got to tense myself up for this. If I get seen, I could die. But when you're traveling around the open world in Assassin's Creed, for the most part, except for a wild animal attacking you, you're just traveling, just getting from A to B. In our game, pirates are everywhere potentially, and you have to be managing your systems all the time. So that sort of like ebb and flow of be tense now and be relaxed now just didn't exist. It was permanent, subtle tension. So it's perfect for a submarine simulator. That's exactly what submarine sims are, right? Hours of boredom punctuated by moments of terror. I can't remember who said that, but I can't take credit for it. The thing is, hours of boredom punctuated by moments of terror works if you're playing a 2-hour scenario where you're getting into a sub because that's the contract you're signing and that's what you want. In an open world game, when you're spending 40 hours in there, Do you really want that dynamic? That was the design problem. But the other problem that we had with it, so there was unknown genre design issues that we had to tackle, but the other problem with it was that that led to heavy player onboarding. If people aren't familiar with the rules of a game world because we're doing something which is highly unique, we need to educate them about what it is that's going to be different about our game. So when they're out there, we had to have a whole number of NPCs explaining to them, be careful, if you run around with your, all your systems turned on so you can see everything at a long distance, you're liable to get shot. We needed to educate the player with some early on safe spaces where they took serious damage but with very little consequence. So, pivoting slightly, deep lore was part of what we considered to be fundamental to an open world. For reference, the wiki that drove the narrative of this game, which we handed off to the 12 writers who helped us piece the story together, was about a year or two's worth of work on its own. I keep wanting to release it, like just release the whole wiki publicly so people can dive in, but apparently it's difficult. There's web hosting issues. I don't know. I'd have to ask Alyssa. Anyway, so deep lore was a part of it. And deep tutorialization comes from having to do heavy player onboarding. Deep tutorialization plus deep lore equals an entire prologue chapter that was linear and took at least half an hour or 40 minutes to get through. Trying to build something which is linear out of something that was designed to be open world was a heck of a challenge on its own. Multiple progression systems, I want to highlight that one again, means that we need to educate the player about 15 different things at once in a short space of time. My approach to try and get this done was to really weave the narrative and the tasks of the tutorial together as tightly as possible, giving people motivations to do every little thing. I was really allergic to that idea that you were just told, you need to do this now, and then you do it, because of course you do. Of course you stop and do that, because I'm learning. I wanted it to just feel seamless. You spend a bunch of time in the world, you don't even realize the tutorial has ended. You never even realized you were in the tutorial. You just spent all of your time learning things because you're getting better at the game. So incredibly seamless, mixed with an open world, separate chapter. So let's go ahead and take these multiple progression systems and feed them back into what essentially became another core pillar of the game midway through development, and that's player freedom. A big part of this is because open worlds, when you think of an open world, you think of player freedom, right? You think of the ability to go anywhere you want. You see that mountain, you can climb it, says every person at E3. So, yeah, we wanted player freedom in our game as well. And I'll get to why that's so difficult. So, this is where it's at the moment. I just thought we'd take a breath, take a look at the current state of the flowchart. I think we're about halfway. So, we wanted to play a character which did not have an actual backstory themselves. When you think of an open world game, you generally think of a player character that is newly arriving in a place. Our setting was a distant series of star systems, a cluster that was far away from Earth, 10 light years away specifically, and we wanted a player that was new to that environment, even though the core narrative was that this world was completely cut off from Earth and had no more ties to it. So our prologue chapter ended up being that your character was on the colony ships that were first coming, and when they did their final jump to get through to the Apollo star cluster, something went wrong and you appeared 44 years too late. So most of your friends are now dead. You get to keep the ship you started in because of a mildly comedic moment where they're like, yeah, they just wrote that into law, you're fine. And you can go about your business. So the Cypher player character and the linear prologue chapter together sort of tie in nicely. The problem there being that it's a lot harder to write something when the player is the character. We don't have a character that responds in certain ways. We have a first-person perspective. You never see your avatar in the game. So whenever we play-tested it and someone would come back and say, I really wanted to say this, I had an option to say, yeah, that sounds great, or I'm not so sure. I also wanted an option to say, no, screw you, you're an asshole. And I'm like, well, there's no player character that I can use as an excuse to mediate this exchange, so sure, I'll add it in. And of course, every time you add in one extra branching dialogue option, you're actually adding 10. So that was a fundamental thing, not just of the tutorial, but of the wider game. Because we were going for a naturalistic presentation, we also didn't want to do a hero's journey. There's no main quest line in Objects in Space. You think of something like Skyrim, and the idea that you're trying to follow the main storyline and then can go do side quests. For ours, we were kind of trying to evoke this, you're a small fish in a big pond at the start and at the end mentality. So as you're going around the game world, you might be the hero of one individual small person's story, but there's no big alien invasion, you're not saving the world, you're nobody and you're nothing. And this tied into some heavy themes around capitalism and alienation, which I won't go into. Unless you want me to, just tell me later on. So, we had to rewrite a whole lot of the stories. And again, 12 different writers wrote something like 120 to 130 different scripts, all of which had to somehow feel like they were written roughly by the same person, or at least harmoniously exist in the same universe. That happened, and I had to go and rewrite to make sure that any time a player wanted a new option, as long as it was a reasonable one, not cowboy banana elephant every time they wanted to speak, that they had that option. So that took an awful lot of work. Then, we had another technical glitch. We had to separate all of the star systems. As you rightly pointed out, one of the problems with an open world game with this much submarine simulation style combat in it is the number of calculations that are going on to figure out whether one ship can see another are massive. They're really CPU intensive. So we had a maximum cap of maybe a dozen or so ships that could be tracked at any given moment, and the best way to make sure we weren't overloading ourselves due to one of the engine limitations was to separate each of the 30 star systems. When you jump from one to another, it completely forgets everything that's behind you. So this starts to get into some hairy territory that combines a number of the problems that we've had. So you can use your jump drive to jump from one star system to the next. You get into a quest that says, can you please go over here, but be careful, it's dangerous. A pirate fires a torpedo at you. Oh no! I jump away, I jump back, the pirate is gone. That was a design problem that I had to solve. We couldn't get around it from a technical perspective. The solution we ended up going with is that jump drives are incredibly noisy. When you're spinning it up, which takes a good 30 seconds to a minute, everyone in the entire star system can see you for miles around. You need to be in the correct quadrant. It's an arduous task to set your course properly, and you need to be stationary before you can make the jump. All of those things combined to make sure that players couldn't just easily cheat their way out of situations. But we had another problem here, which is broken ships. Multiple progression systems, players can customize their ship customization and broken ships. I think I added both at once. So ship customization follows on from the basic tenet of player freedom and multiple progression systems. You should be able to build your ship in any way that you want to. Fill it with parts that are nice and quiet, load it up with heaps of weapons or no weapons at all so that you can play it stealth. You can be a massive cargo liner with lots of defense. You can be an attack ship and go for bounty hunting, not separated by class because that's arbitrary and video gamey, and we'll have no arbitrary video game things in our game. So no picking of classes, you just make the ship that you want to make and it'll be better in one direction or another. Which means that in theory, someone could make a ship which is so awful that they undock and the damn thing doesn't move. How do I solve that? I don't like the idea of someone being stuck in space forever. Having a dead end that you didn't really clearly telegraph is just a horrible piece of design. So I had to figure out, well, can we just not have them be allowed to undock unless their ship is actually space-worthy? And no, we can't because of broken ships. If you've got a broken ship out there because you took a couple of torpedoes and one of them took out your rotational thrusters so you can no longer turn, we have to account for that. Or they took out your main thruster so you can't stop. Any number of things. Those screens I showed you at the beginning, every one of those monitors can be completely off. You can be completely dead in the water in this game. So we realized that it's nothing to do with whether or not you dock or undock. If you can blow off parts of the functionality of a ship, you can disable it, and the player has to be able to get out of that. So here are 3 systems which were necessitated by that in rapid fire. First of all, the player needed to send out an SOS signal, and again, in accordance with the jump drive non-breaking gameplay exploit thing, we needed to make sure that it took several minutes for a ship to arrive and tow you back to base. But that couldn't just be infinite, that needed to cost you something. So if you got back to base and you couldn't afford the tow, what happens? Well, naturally, we had to introduce a debt system. You had to be able to borrow money, go into debt, that money had to be able to accrue interest, but what's the point of it accruing interest if it doesn't negatively affect your game? So we introduced the bounty hunter system. The bounty hunter system allows ships to constantly spawn and try and chase you down and demand that you drop your cargo, and if you do, it takes the cost of your cargo off the existing debt for one of 9 different banks throughout the star systems because, again, there are 8 nations. And we didn't think it was realistic. Don't know why I'm using the word realistic here, but we didn't think it was realistic to have one bank across 8 different star systems or 8 nations. Okay, so which element are we looking at now? Right, oh, this was one of the hidden benefits. So we went through all those systems, and that was a real nightmare, but the fact that we now had a bounty hunter system was great, because it meant that the choose-your-own-adventure dialogue style, where you could just say screw you to any NPC that you wanted to, mixed with our ideas for multiple progression systems, and the idea of player freedom, we could now insert something into any story that we wanted with meaningful consequences. If you get told this is the morally right thing to do and you're going to suffer for it, or the morally wrong thing to do is going to give you a bunch of money, that suffering can now come in the form of us spawning some quest-specific bounty hunters that go after you, and just as they fire, they, say something along the lines of, what's the guy's name from Mafia? Salieri. The first name of the Don from Mafia 1. Does anyone know it? Damn. Okay, I was going to go for Salieri says hello. It's one of the last lines in Mafia. Spoilers. It's been 2003, come on. Okay, so in any case, that ended up being a really useful thing, but in order for it to be a useful thing, it had to be... okay, sorry, next slide. At this point, the game's getting very bloated. It's getting very complicated. You might notice that there are a whole bunch of quests that you can keep track of. Time is constantly passing, so if you don't complete a quest within a certain time limit, they don't just sit there waiting for you. Everything has a time limit. We don't just have the NPC-driven story quests, we also have the procedurally driven economic quests, and all of them have expiration dates. To keep track of all of this, as well as where you are in the universe, basically we realized why every single RPG or open world game out there has a gargantuan menu system with different tabs you can scroll between to try and figure out what's going on. It's just a nightmare to not have that. But how do we do that when we don't have a HUD? We don't want something like a menu system at all. We just want you to be in the game world, because immersion. So we added a PDA tracker. That was the thing that you were talking to that NPC through. So it's a sort of like retro thing. It kind of looks like a clunky calculator. It slides in on the side of the screen like you're using it, and it's got your map of the game world, all the current quests, which are listed under your personal journal, stats about your ship, which again are not stats. They are the properties of the individual components that exist on your ship. And when you're talking to someone, it opens up a new tab that just says translator mode, and then tells you what language the person is speaking to you in, and that's our excuse for not having to record any dialogue. I am still proud of that one. So, the PDA tracker was an incredibly useful thing, but basically we just had to design from the bottom up a series of different pieces of UI that all had to relate properly to the game and update correctly. That was a huge undertaking in and of itself. Like, designing all of the software for a PDA device is no small task, and it was just one of the smaller things that we had to do in this game. But this was the slide I thought we were getting to last time, because we've now got all these bounty hunters at our disposal, and now there's all these reasons why people might try and hunt you down and kill you if you really screw them over. I had to do more rewrites. So this rewrite was for player consequences. At any stage, in any quest, because of the player freedom core pillar that we were adhering to, we had to account for a player that goes, sure, I'll get your child safely to that moon over there. And then the child gets on board, and then the player goes, huh, psych, just jumps off to another star system. I don't know why the player would do this, but if they can, the game still needed to react somehow. So what do? Eventually you'd have to get a message from the person going, excuse me, my child is still on your ship, what's up with that? More importantly, you only have one passenger cabin. Taking passengers is a big way of making money in the game. The child needs to get off somehow. So at a certain point, once time has expired, you might get a warning message, and then the child will get off at whatever the next space station is and just say, I'm scared. You said you were going to do something and you didn't. I'm running away now. And then the conversation closes, and then you get a nice email from the parent of the child saying, I've got bounty hunters coming after you. Why they can afford bounty hunters but not to transport their child, I don't know. This was a made-up example. So, another rewrite. So, yeah, that's the third one, I think. Now, in order to keep in the idea that this is a naturalistic game, we wanted an engineering section, which I showed you earlier. Every part in the game really exists. Every part has a brand. Every brand has a speciality, whether it's defense, low emissions, so you're nice and invisible, or anything else. So that was a massive system which governed all of the damage. Underneath that, we had to buy and sell all of those parts. Every time you're on a space station, there had to be a buying and selling screen available to you where you could buy and sell things. Sure, makes sense, it follows, whatever. We started putting that into play in early access, and people were like, I only want to be able to buy my favorite brand. I'm like, oh. The low-fi pixel art style of this meant that we were working with about 320 by 200 pixels on a complicated UI screen that had to tell you what you had for sale, what you had on your ship, how those two things compared, and now they were asking us to add filters and options and things which frankly are standard in really big complicated games, but 320 by 200 pixels. So we had to add filters and options, and that was an absolute nightmare. And here we are. So this is the gargantuan, messy end of what objects in space is. The red ones, by the way, are just particularly thorny ones that I thought were worth calling out. This is what objects in space is, although I hasten to add that I've probably left off at least half a dozen major systems for the sake of brevity. So be careful with the genres you pick, is that moral of that story. And I do actually have a few useful takeaways for you for things I'd like to just impart. But take it in and realize that this is what 5 years looks like. And it started with just, let's make an open world submarine simulator. Open worlds are big. That's certainly something everyone knows, but you don't really know it until you make one. And the naturalistic and player freedom tenets amplified the problems that we had massively. If either one of or both of those two had been cut, maybe we could have actually delivered this thing in a smaller time frame. And the amount of reward that we really got for the player by adhering to those core pillars, it existed, it was there, but it's not that important. If you're flying around in the game world and you're missing stories that are going on the other side of the galaxy because time is passing, the player doesn't know that. You're not sitting there being told actively you just missed a quest, and if you were, what good is that to you? I'm sorry, I'm flying around doing the thing you're asking me to do, being an independent trader, and you're somehow telling me I'm being punished? So it had to be invisible punishment. If it's invisible punishment, it's not really punishment. So it's just arbitrary. It didn't really improve the player experience as much as we would have liked. Typical playthrough of this game, you might see a third of the quests. In any given quest, you'll probably end up seeing about a quarter of the potential dialogue. Most of the content that we spent ages writing, people didn't see. To give you an understanding of this, according to our publisher, there are over 500,000 words of dialogue in this game. Did I mention this was written by a dozen or so people and then just myself and Alyssa, and yeah, it's a small team. So, how, if you're a designer who also has to do the hard work of saying no to yourself, might you avoid these things? Well, what I would suggest is there is a way around this. You just have to be incredibly disciplined with yourself and avoid putting something in because it would definitely be cool and having that be the end of the conversation. It's easy to see the benefits of a feature you've come up with, but try to tell yourself, is it worth it, is very tricky when you're trying to be the prisoner and the prison guard at the same time. You do not need a full design document before you set forth on something like this, but trying to list and itemize every expectation that you can think of from the genre that you're choosing, doing a little bit of research and going, this is everything that's expected of us, and these are how those things interact with the other core mechanics for the core loop that we're putting together, and you'll start to see some of the things emerge that we've discussed here today. Hopefully that'll give you an idea of just how big and bad the project is. So do that due diligence, look at the expectations of the genre, and then figure out, has anyone done this before? Has anyone done a submarine simulator in space? No? Okay. So there are a lot of unknowns. Those unknowns are going to be risks which might or might not blow out, and we won't know until we make them. If someone has done this before, if someone has done this blend, look at what they've done and see which design problems are already solved. There's no need to reinvent the wheel, especially if you're doing a really, really big game. So once you've figured out what your game is supposed to be, before you put any work into design, see what else is going on. See if other designers have had these challenges. Ask designers in your industry if they've had to solve these problems before. Maybe they haven't, but maybe they know people who have, or have been to conferences you haven't, and that sort of thing. So you kind of want to try and weigh up every design decision that you're making. And there are a few steps to that. The first one is you need to be conscious that you're making a design decision. So when your programmer, for example, comes to you and says, should you be able to go into warp while at full speed? That's a design problem. What are the benefits of going to warp at full speed? What are the negatives from the point of the player experience, from a designer's perspective? What are the negatives in terms of what other systems are going on at any given time that this might possibly affect? How are those systems being affected, etc.? So what you want to do is try and figure out which things you know, which things you don't, prioritize the things you don't and prototype them first, before anything else. Get it to a stage where everything left on your roadmap to finish your game is a series of known quantities. Because if you're a producer and a designer by necessity, because you're working at an indie studio, really, you're probably a producer or a designer. I'm using the term producer loosely, but basically what I mean is I'm much more of a designer. I was a producer because we didn't have one, but whenever my producer and designer were doing battle in my head, the designer always won, because it would be so cool. So this is the handy list I would suggest you try and take away if you're going to do something like this yourself. If you're embarking on an indie game, you don't have a producer who can be there to sit there and go, no, you can't do that. So what resources do you have at your disposal? How much time can you really dedicate to this from which people? How risky is it? And there's two dimensions to that. How risky is it for the player experience? Does this impact the other systems in my game? And if so, to what extent might it impact them negatively? And on a technical perspective, how is this likely to play with our engine, on our platforms, with the other systems that are already going on at once? Do we accidentally overload the CPU with too many sensor things going on at once? How long is it going to take to do? And you'll only really know that if it's been solved elsewhere by other people before, or if someone on your team has done it before. So once you've done all three of those first three things, which are the unromantic ones that are not very big on design, then you come down to really, seriously, how important is this to the player experience? Am I really, really going to improve my game that much if this gets in there? And put it up as a matrix. Put it up as a little chart for yourself. Pros, cons, which systems are now at risk as a result of the change you're making. Evaluate it that way. So that would be my handy little guide, and hopefully stepping through all of the gargantuan mistakes that we made to try and make our game will give you an understanding of where we're at. Again, in 5 years, it was worth it. We made something we're really proud of, and we're really happy to have built it. I built an open world. I got to design the whole thing from scratch. I couldn't be happier about that. But as I say, most of the money that we needed to take on to keep ourselves in development largely gets recouped by other people first, and rightly so. So we're just in a position now where we're like, okay, that was intense. We should not have made those mistakes. Still cool, though. Any questions? Zoe?
Which of the core pillars would you sacrifice in retrospect to still keep a game you're proud of?
Sorry, they're recording this, so you have to use the microphone.
Sorry, do you want me to repeat it? Or?
That's okay. The question was, which core pillars would we sacrifice if we were going to repeat it? Frankly, the way that we could possibly have gotten this done in the budget that we have, we would have had to not make an open world game at all. If I were to scale it down so we only had to mortgage our sales a couple of times instead of 3 or 4 times to get us to the end, I probably would have sacrificed the naturalistic tenet, because that one just, there's so many easy things. Just the ability to throw a message up on screen to the player going, "You're going the wrong way, idiot." You can't underestimate how useful it is to have that ability. You take that away from a designer, and all of a sudden, yeah, nightmare. So I guess it depends. If you want it to come in budget, we basically just would have made a combat submarine simulator that was very close to the sub-sims of the late 80s and early 90s. We just would have done it in space. Next question? Did I see another hand go up before?
This is slightly off topic, but how on earth did you manage to successfully refund so many times? Like, how did you convince new investors that you weren't just like vaporware?
Good question. Did I mention my background was in PR? In all seriousness, that helped a lot. Having the ability to pitch something and knowing what someone else is looking for and what they want to hear is a really valuable skill. I've pitched for different grants and things 5 times, not just for Flat Earth, but for previous things as well. I used to work in startup, and yeah, every time I managed to get successfully funded for whatever it is I was pitching for. They were only small amounts, but yeah. When it comes to government grants, the suggestion I would make is get on the phone to whoever it is that's going to be looking over the grant applications, figure out what they're looking for, what they want, what they're really trying to get out of applicants, because they have money, they want to be able to give it out so that they can get that money again, so they can give it out again, and then the whole miserable cycle repeats itself. So try and get on the phone, figure out who your audience is and what they want to hear, and then deliver that to them. That would be my advice as far as government grants goes. As far as getting private investment and a publisher on board and things like that, most of that came because they kind of saw what we were doing was cool and unique. We got approached in both instances by people who wanted to help us out, who wanted to come to us with funding opportunities and say, what you're making looks dope, can we help out in some way? And make money off it in some way. But I'm focusing on the former. Basically, we went to shows. We took our game to so many different PAXs, down to AvCon, we took it to Seattle, to Boston, and if anyone here has been familiar with the progress, you'll know that one of the key systems I left off that flowchart was that this game interfaces with physical hardware that you can build yourself at home. That took a huge amount of time. We had it going through Arduinos and a virtual serial port, so you can make something with physical switches, levers, and gauges to simulate the experience of being in your own ship. Then we built one ourselves, and we took it to shows. And that was amazing because we got all of this great press. People were saying, check this out, these absolutely insane bastards built a whole ship that you can really use. And that was fantastic. It got us a lot of press, and that press got us a lot of attention, which got us, frankly, investors and publishers knocking on our door going, hey, how's it going? That looks cool. It also shot us in the foot because then everywhere I went, I said objects in space, and people were like, oh, that game with the big spaceship. I'm like, yeah, that's the one. They're like, oh man, I would so buy that game if I didn't have to build that. I'm like, oh, no, that's not necessary. Keyboard and mouse is fine. We ended up including at the beginning of trailers, you can play this with a keyboard and mouse, as though it's a feature. So I guess that's the answer. We found something that was a totally unique selling point, and we showed it off and we leveraged it hard. That was how we got that attention. But the initial funding was government grants, and that's how we did it. As for them deciding that we were definitely going to finish the game, I don't know. I guess we did, so they weren't wrong. I think they just probably looked at us and went, you are stubborn and slightly mad. This is going to be great. And I was, and I am, so it's good. Anyone else?
You mentioned already about refinancing, but how did you, especially as the scope blew out and you started to realize the daunting pressure that was putting on, how did you manage mentally over the course and sort of keep that from blowing out your own internal deadlines, especially when you took on publishers and you had to deal with their deadlines?
I think there's a pretty familiar, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know, it's like a graph you can follow in game dev. There's this period of absolute excitement where anything's possible and all ideas are on the table and people are just excitedly throwing around what this thing is going to be, and you're starting to build it and you're like, oh, it's starting to work, it's starting to work. And then you enter into the long hell of the pit of despair as you realize that now you've got to try and make enough content for all those things to work and spend all your time polishing and bug fixing. So that pattern, as far as I can tell, wasn't any different for us than it was to anyone else. It was just more protracted. The fact that we had to be in that long sort of, pit of development hell for years on end, I don't know if there was a specific thing we did to manage it. We actually both did seriously suffer some major depression trying to get through to the end of this game. In the last year or so that I've been working not as an indie, working for a company that pays me every 2 weeks. 2 weeks. They give me holidays if I want to. I don't have to try and pitch my game concepts, otherwise I run out of money. And it's night and day. I actually was very surprised because I think as we got into that really dark patch, we got there slowly. As you've seen from the flowchart, this all happened one piece at a time. We didn't realize all of a sudden that we were in this place. We just got there. But going and getting back into full-time work, that was very, very different. I can hold conversations a lot better now. I can retain information a lot better, like actual cognitive deficiencies that were existing in me throughout the largest part of development of objects in space are no longer a thing. So on every level, I can see the difference now, but it's really difficult to tell when you're in there. So I think the reason why we managed to make it through is because what choice did we have? Were we going to stop and have nothing to show for it and have taken on all of this money? Alyssa and I are both very guilty feeling people. If someone gives us some money, we're like, we have to pay them back come hell or high water. It's really important to us to get things back onto an even keel. So it was stubbornness, it was sunk cost fallacy, and it was not really seeing the cloud we were in until we got out of it.
I was just wondering if you could speak to whether the size of your core team being only 2 people actually affected this process, and whether you feel like a bigger team might have changed that or not, or yeah, just in and around that.
I think having more voices in the room would have helped, because if there was a few more people who were a little less maniacal, who weren't so into the idea of what they were making, they might have been able to turn around and say no. And having someone on board whose job it was to oversee the wider production while I was off solving design problems and Alyssa was solving technical ones definitely would have helped that process. I think the larger the number of people you have working on a project, as long as you don't have one person at the top who's like a tyrant, you can generally find ways to make sure that you're not doing anything that's going to hurt the team. I think with Alyssa and I, we had a lot of contractors, people came on to do bits and pieces of concept art or sound effects or music or writing or stuff like that, but that was just one-off piece rate type things just to get the assets in. But we did have our lead artist who was working for a percentage of profits, and he was there 1 day a week, every Monday like clockwork, and stuck with us for years. The amount of guilt that we felt about that was absolutely immense, because ultimately it was still Alyssa and I trying to make this thing, and he felt like he was suffering the negatives of the decisions we were making. If we'd have had more people that we were responsible for, it would have been harder and harder for us to make but it would be really cool decisions. So for a number of reasons, it would have helped to have a bigger team. I don't know if it would have sped up production all that much. It probably would have. There's a million things I could have gotten other people to do. Next question.
Hi. How did it affect your relationship with your sister?
Oh, that was really trying. That's part of the problem, is that our relationship eventually became entirely about the work. And when the work is a long period of uncertain futures, very little income, not knowing whether or not it's all going to come together in the end, as well as the tension of getting on each other's nerves and that sort of thing, it was really, really tough. I think we're still trying to recover from that experience. I probably can't understate that part enough. It was really difficult, and I think with something like that, it's important to try and note that your ability to have conflict and to resolve it and move forward is useful, but only up to a point. The number of conflicts that then had to be resolved, we were good at that, that core loop part of dispute resolution, where we could figure out a way to describe what we were both saying, get on the same page, make a decision, and move forward. We were good at that. But when you multiply that by years and years and years, and eventually there's a small amount of resentment that builds up because of one dispute or another or another or another, then eventually it's a more deep-seated toll that's getting taken. So the meta loop of our relationship was broken, if you will. I think we're still trying to recover from that, and that's very much worth considering. Thanks for asking it. Did I see another hand over here? One more after this one? Okay.
Hey, did prototyping hint at any of these problems that you faced?
No. We prototyped the core loop of the game. Prototyping a massive open world is a difficult and different thing, and the amount of content that's going in is really the main thing that sets it apart from other types of experiences. So, yeah, we prototyped the core loop and found a tight combat system that was awesome, and then built an open world around that, figuring the two would be independent of one another. So all we saw from our combat thing was, wow, if we just tell people there's a torpedo out there, they have the same terrifying panicked reaction that they would if they could actually see it. People's imaginations are great. This is going to be awesome. I don't know which hand went up next.
Which one?
You mentioned briefly that you moved on to wargaming. You have the stability there. What's Alyssa done?
Oh, Alyssa's a programmer over at Blowfish Studios now. They are sitting immediately behind you and to your right. Okay. All right, thank you all very much for coming. Have a great GCAP.